Welcome to the principle of continuity and reversibility, also known as the training principle of reversibility. What will you learn in this lecture? We talk about the basic premise of this principle of continuity and reversibility, the biological basis for this principle, and we have a look at the practical application. What is the basic premise for this principle? Well, the basic premise is different biological subsystems have different time courses of adaptation. We looked at the so-called heterochronicity of adaptations in the previous lecture, where we can see that different structures have different time courses of adaptation, but also see that different training stimuli go through the adaptative process either quicker or need a bit longer. So, biological subsystems have different time courses, and for an adaptation to manifest, you have to go through, number one, the adaptive process. I outlined that previously, stimulus, recovery, adaptation, but also the cycle of acute adaptations to chronic adaptations. What's the biological basis for that principle? So, the biological principle of de-adaptation. I talked about de-adaptation a few times before, but I never really gave you a definition. Adaptation is basically the ability to adjust to an environment and undergoing physiological changes. And de-adaptation is the adaptation to a previous form. So it basically reverses the adaptative process. So that's why it's also often called the principle of reversibility. So why call it continuity and reversibility? I outlined that previously when I talked about the principle, the also known as principle of variation, where I much rather like to say the principle of a varied stimulus, because it puts the stimulus in the center and not the variation. And the same is true here. If we only talk about reversibility, the focus is reversibility. But actually what we are after in our training is we want to have continuity in our training. We want to have a continuous and progressive process. And Nikolai Bernstein said it best, training as repetition without repeating, which means repetition is the continuous process and without repeating is progressive. So you're not doing the same thing again. It is repetitive, but you don't repeat. And before we get to the practical application, I still owe you one answer. What is the cycle of acute adaptations to chronic adaptations? In very simple words, an acute adaptation to exercise will become a chronic adaptation to exercise after a certain number of exposures. For example, Bondarchuk has taken up that concept in his training model, that you need to have a certain number of exposures to a training stimulus before that training stimulus manifests, and then you can go on into the next phase, how he does it. But if we look at, for example, Isurin and his theory of block periodization, he talks about something that is called residual effects. And these residual effects is the retention of changes induced by systematic workloads beyond a certain time period after the cessation of training. And Bondarchuk, and Isurin also gives outlines of how long that retention is for the different biomotor abilities. So, what is the practical application of this principle of continuity and reversibility? We talked about the residual effects. Again, shameless plug here from my strength training course. There are also initial effects, which are the initial increases in performance after the implementation of a new training method. And there are so-called ceiling effects, which is the deceleration or cessation of training adaptations following a current training method. And this is what we had before, right? The adaptive response to different training stimuli. And in that course, I also outline guidelines. Again, it's not written in stone because it depends on multiple factors, but these are guidelines. When do you have the initial effects? When you train for hypertrophy, maximum strength or power, and when do you have the ceiling effect? So with this information, you basically know when you have to change a varied stimulus, when you have to change the training stimulus. So what did we cover? We looked at the basic premise of this principle of continuity and reversibility. Yeah. So training has to be continuous and progressive. That's why it's called continuity. If it's not, it will be reversing to the previous adaptation. We looked at the biological basis. We talked about adaptation and de-adaptation. And we looked at the practical application, how that could look in your training practice. I see you in the next lesson when we talk about the principle of periodization and cyclicization. If you've missed the previous one on stimulus and response, you can also check it out here and subscribe. I see you in the next one when we talk about periodization and cyclicization.